You ever feel that heavy knot in your stomach when you realize someone has just gone too far and there's no turning back from the storm they've unleashed? That's exactly what I felt that morning as I opened the front door and found 2 police officers standing on my porch. Their cruisers sat at the curb, lights off but engines humming, and behind them, like a vulture waiting to feast, was Karen, our HOA president, sitting in her car with her phone out, grinning like she'd just pulled the winning lottery ticket. It wasn't the first time Karen had tried to drag me down. She was the type of neighbor who believed her HOA badge was equivalent to a crown, ruling over everyone else in the community like we were peasants meant to bend at her word. My wife and I had already endured her letters, fines, and constant threats. She didn't like our truck parked in the driveway because she claimed it lowered property values. She said the American flag on our porch was an unauthorized structure. She even sent a warning about the sound of my lawnmower, insisting I mow only on HOA-approved days. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so exhausting, and yet, nothing compared to that day. "Sir," the taller officer said, clipboard in hand, "we've received a complaint from your HOA regarding several violations. We need to discuss these with you." Karen's smug face glowed from the driver's seat of her car. She tilted her head just enough so I could see the smirk plastered across her lips, her phone angled to capture the moment she thought would be my downfall. To her, this was the grand finale, the big takedown she'd been waiting for. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms, studying the officers. They weren't hostile, but they weren't exactly here to chat either. They had that stiff, rehearsed posture, caught between trying to look authoritative and clearly wishing they didn't have to be there at all. "What violations are we talking about exactly?" I asked, my tone calm, controlled. The younger cop glanced down at the clipboard. His voice carried the hesitant cadence of someone reading a script he didn't fully believe in. Unapproved modifications to the property, failure to maintain landscaping, and, unauthorized display." "Unauthorized display," I repeated slowly, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the flag?" He nodded, clearly uncomfortable. The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh out loud. Karen had actually convinced these officers to show up at my house because of my flag and the fact my shrubs weren't trimmed like a military parade ground. My eyes flicked past them to her car again, and sure enough, she was recording, waiting to see me beg, argue, or snap. She thrived on drama, on humiliation, on seeing her neighbors crushed under the HOA's heel. But what she didn't know was that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath her was about to crumble. I kept my expression neutral. "Gentlemen," I said, "I think there's been a mistake. You're telling me you drove out here because Karen doesn't like how my house looks?" The older cop, who had been silent so far, finally spoke. His voice was gruff but steady. "We just respond to calls, sir. We don't make the rules. HOA claimed non-compliance, so we're here to investigate." Karen's voice cut across the yard before I could answer. "Investigate thoroughly, officers. He's been violating the rules for months, and he thinks he's above everyone else. About time someone put him in his place." Her shrill voice carried easily over the quiet suburban street, making a couple of curtains twitch from nearby windows. Neighbors were starting to watch. That was exactly what she wanted, a spectacle. To her, public shaming was the sharpest tool in her arsenal. I exhaled slowly, keeping my cool. Losing my temper would only feed her narrative. But inside I felt that familiar burn in my chest, the anger that came from watching someone abuse power just because they could. She had no idea what line she'd just crossed. The officers shifted uncomfortably, caught between her heckling and my silence. The younger one glanced at me again, maybe looking for some hint of defiance, some reason to escalate. But instead of answering, I just stepped aside slightly, resting my shoulder against the doorframe like I had all the time in the world. "You want to come in and talk about this?" I asked casually. The older cop shook his head. "No need to come in. We just need to confirm the situation outside." Karen chimed in again, louder this time. "Make sure you cite him. He's been warned multiple times and he keeps ignoring the rules. He thinks just because his wife—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing as she saw movement behind me. And that's when everything shifted. The door behind me opened wider, and my wife stepped out. She wasn't in her usual jeans or casual clothes. She was in full uniform, polished boots, pressed shirt, badge glinting in the morning sun. Her hair was pulled back tight, her presence sharp and commanding. She had just come off a long shift, and though she looked tired, the aura she carried was undeniable. Authority, respect, and power. The officer's reaction was instant. Their words froze in their throats, their stiff posture snapping into something far more respectful. The younger one actually stammered, his eyes widening as he registered who she was. "Ma'am?" the older cop said quickly, giving a small nod. Karen's smirk faltered. From her car, she lowered her phone just slightly, confusion flickering across her face as if she couldn't compute what she was seeing. My wife crossed her arms, her gaze steady and piercing as she looked at the two officers. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone calm but firm, "what exactly is going on here?" The silence that followed was almost comical. The cops, who moments ago were parroting HOA complaints, now looked like schoolboys caught misbehaving in front of the principal. Karen, on the other hand, was still too arrogant to see the train wreck heading her way. She leaned halfway out of her car window and shouted, "Don't let her distract you! He's breaking the rules and you're here to enforce them. Do your job." My wife turned her head just slightly in Karen's direction, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. The kind of look that didn't need words to communicate volumes. The younger officer cleared his throat, fumbling with his clipboard. Just responding to a complaint from the HOA, ma'am. They, alleged multiple violations." My wife stepped forward, her boots clicking against the porch as she closed the distance between her and the officers. "And you thought that warranted showing up at a private residence for, what? An untrimmed hedge? A flag on a porch? That's not law enforcement. That's harassment." The officers exchanged nervous glances. Karen's triumphant glow had faded, replaced with unease. She clearly hadn't expected my wife to carry authority that outweighed her petty HOA title. I stayed quiet, letting my wife command the space. I knew better than to interrupt when she was in this mode. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was control, the kind of presence that came from years of training and service. And it was dismantling Karen's little scheme piece by piece. Karen shouted again, but this time her voice cracked, a tinge of desperation creeping in. "You can't just ignore violations. The HOA has rules and rules are rules." My wife turned fully toward her now, her voice carrying across the street with icy precision. "And the HOA doesn't override state law. Calling the police for nonsense like this wastes resources. If you think my husband's porch flag is a crime, then maybe you need to educate yourself on the actual law." The look on Karen's face was priceless. Her phone, once proudly raised, was now resting limply in her lap. Her confidence wavered, her lips pressed into a thin line. Meanwhile, the officers were practically backpedaling. The older one finally spoke again, his voice softer now. "We'll, make a note of the complaint and close it out, ma'am." "No need for further action." Karen's eyes widened. "What? No! You can't just walk away," she screeched, slamming her hands against her steering wheel. But it was too late. The cops had already turned away from her, their authority redirected toward the only uniform that actually mattered here, my wife's. As they retreated toward their cruiser, heads bowed slightly in embarrassment, Karen's panic began to bubble over. For the first time since we'd moved into this neighborhood, her power had slipped, and she didn't know how to handle it. I glanced at my wife, a small smile tugging at my lips. She didn't even have to raise her voice to crush the entire charade. Karen thought she had set the stage for my humiliation. Instead, she had just set herself up for a reckoning she never saw coming, and that was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. If anything, having the officers leave empty-handed only fueled her fury. The sight of her sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, told me everything. She wasn't going to let this end here. For her, losing in front of neighbors, cops, and my wife wasn't just a setback, it was humiliation. And Karen never forgot humiliation. She screeched her tires as she pulled away from the curb, her phone still in her hand. I knew that meant she was already firing off emails, making calls, maybe even drafting one of her infamous HOA newsletters dripping with passive-aggressive venom. The woman treated community drama like a battlefield, and she'd just taken a loss she couldn't stomach. Inside, my wife slipped off her boots, setting them neatly by the door. "She won't stop," she said matter-of-factly, as if reading my thoughts. Her uniform jacket rustled as she hung it up, her badge catching the last bit of sunlight before she set it on the counter. "That woman is addicted to control," I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, and we just embarrassed her in front of the entire street. You know she's plotting round 2 already." My wife leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Let her. The more she pushes, the closer she gets to crossing a line she can't come back from." That line was closer than Karen realized. The next morning, it started with letters. Not the kind slipped politely into a mailbox, but thick envelopes taped aggressively to our door, stamped with HOA letterhead and Karen's signature. Each one accused us of fresh violations: improper lawn height, unauthorized window blinds, even a claim that our trash cans were unsightly because they were visible from the street. She wasn't subtle. This was a paper war, her way of burying us in fines and threats until we broke. But what Karen didn't understand was that I wasn't some fragile neighbor afraid of her clipboard tyranny. I'd dealt with tougher enemies both in life and in work. I'd faced real consequences, not the hollow threats of a self-appointed neighborhood monarch. And my wife, well, she had the law itself standing behind her, an armor Karen couldn't penetrate. I kept every letter, every email she fired off. I didn't respond, didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I compiled them, building a file that was starting to look less like a list of violations and more like a record of harassment. By the end of the week, the situation escalated. Karen didn't just stop at letters. One afternoon, I caught her trespassing, walking along the side of our house, snapping pictures with her phone, crouching to photograph the base of the fence like she was collecting evidence for a courtroom drama. I stepped outside. "You lost?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. Karen straightened, her phone still raised like a weapon. "This is an inspection," she snapped. "HOA regulations allow me to—" "They don't allow you to set foot on my property without permission," I interrupted, my voice calm but edged with steel. "Get off." She hesitated, lips pursed, but the look in my eyes must have told her I wasn't joking. With a huff, she turned, stomping down the driveway like a scorned child. But not before muttering something about bringing in the board. And sure enough, 2 nights later, a meeting was called. The HOA gatherings were usually dull affairs held in the community center, filled with bored neighbors half listening as Karen droned on about dues and shrubbery. But this time the room buzzed with tension. Word had spread about her run-in with the cops and my wife's uniform. Some people whispered support for us. Others kept quiet, afraid to speak against Karen. She stood at the front like a general preparing for battle, her binder thick with papers, her voice sharp as she listed my alleged infractions. "This homeowner has repeatedly violated our community standards," she declared, slapping the binder for effect. "He disregards warnings, disrespects the authority of this board, and sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow this behavior to continue, our entire neighborhood will fall into chaos. Chaos. Over a flag and a lawnmower, I let her finish her tirade before standing. The room quieted, eyes turning toward me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You called the police because you don't like my flag," I said evenly. "You trespassed on my property without permission. You've issued dozens of baseless fines that have no grounding in law. And now you're standing here pretending this is about community standards when it's really about your ego." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors looked shocked. Others nodded subtly, finally seeing someone say what they'd been too afraid to voice. Karen's face turned red, her composure cracking. You have no respect for this board." "That's because this board," I said, pointing directly at her, "has forgotten what it's supposed to be. An HOA is meant to serve its residents, not harass them. You've turned it into your personal kingdom. But kingdoms fall, Karen." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Karen sputtered, flipping through her binder as if the papers could save her. But the damage was done. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me quietly, whispering their own frustrations. Stories of unfair fines, threats, and Karen's constant meddling poured out. It wasn't just me she'd targeted. It was everyone. I realized then that Karen hadn't just picked a fight with me. She'd built a mountain of enemies without even knowing it. Back at home, my wife listened as I recounted the meeting. She smirked, shaking her head. Sounds like she's losing her grip. Yeah, I said. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous. She's not going to stop until she's forced to. And forced she would be. Because while Karen was busy trying to ruin my life with HOA bylaws, I was quietly preparing something she couldn't escape. I compiled the evidence, every letter, every photo, every recording of her screaming across the street. I documented her trespassing. I included statements from neighbors brave enough to speak out. Piece by piece, I built a case not for the HOA, but for something bigger, something legal, something that went beyond her little kingdom. By the time I was done, my file was thick, undeniable. Harassment, abuse of authority, misuse of emergency services, trespassing. She thought she was untouchable, but she was standing on quicksand, and I had the map showing exactly where to step to make her sink. The next weekend, it all came to a head. I was working in the yard, sweat dripping down my back, when Karen marched up the street with a group of her loyalists in tow. They carried clipboards, cameras, even tape measures like they were storming a crime scene. Neighbors peeked out from behind blinds, watching the circus unfold. Karen pointed at my house like she was unveiling a criminal empire. This is the example of what happens when rules are ignored. This property is a disgrace to our community. I straightened slowly, wiping the sweat from my brow. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled briefly, and then hit play. Karen's voice echoed across the yard from a recording I'd captured earlier, her screaming threats, admitting she called the police just to teach me a lesson, boasting that she would make my life hell until I moved out. The crowd went dead silent. Karen's face drained of color. Her loyalists shifted uncomfortably, their resolve crumbling. I let the recording play in full, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. That's harassment, I said flatly. And it's on record. I've already forwarded copies to the county attorney's office. The police are aware too. So if you want to keep pushing this, Karen, understand you're not just dealing with me anymore. You're dealing with the law. Gasps rippled through the group. Karen stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. You can't, but her words failed her. For the first time, she had no script, no binder thick enough to shield her. The moment hung in the air like a thunderstorm about to break. And I knew this was the turning point. The empire Karen had built on fear and fines was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. What she didn't realize yet was that the final blow hadn't even landed. That was still to come. The silence after I played that recording lingered longer than I expected. It wasn't just the silence of shock, it was the sound of a neighborhood finally waking up. People who had been cowed into submission by Karen's rules and threats suddenly realized that she wasn't invincible. She wasn't some ironclad enforcer of order. She was just a neighbor with a binder, a loud voice, and too much time on her hands. Karen's face was a storm. Red cheeks, clenched jaw, eyes darting between the neighbors who no longer looked at her with admiration but with unease. She had built her power on their fear, and now that fear was evaporating. Without it, she was just another homeowner standing on the curb, her authority slipping through her fingers like sand. You think this little stunt will stop me? She snapped finally, voice cracking under the strain. You're finished in this neighborhood. I'll see to it. But no one cheered her on. No one echoed her threats. Her loyalists shuffled uncomfortably, muttering excuses as they drifted away one by one. Karen called after them, but they didn't turn back. She stood alone, binder clutched to her chest like a shield, staring at me with venom. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. The recording had spoken for me. Later that evening, my wife came home and listened carefully as I explained what had happened. She leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. She's unraveling, she said simply. People like her always do once they lose their grip. I wanted to believe it was over. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She was too obsessed, too prideful. And I was right. 2 nights later, just past midnight, there was a pounding on the door. My heart jumped as I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on the porch. Their flashlights cut across the yard, and one of them looked uneasy. "Sir?" the taller officer began. "We received a report of a domestic disturbance at this address." I blinked. "A what?" He cleared his throat, glancing at his partner. "Caller stated they heard shouting, breaking glass, possible violence." My wife appeared at my side, wearing her off-duty jacket with her badge clipped to the front. The second officer's eyes widened slightly at the sight of it. My wife crossed her arms, her tone firm. "There's no disturbance here, and I'd like to know who made this report." The taller officer hesitated. "We can't disclose that information, ma'am. But if this was a false report..." "It was," she said flatly. "And I expect this to be documented properly." The officers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. They gave the house a quick glance, found nothing amiss, and apologized before leaving. As the patrol car rolled down the street, I spotted a silhouette peeking from behind curtains across the way. Karen, that was the line she shouldn't have. Crossed, swatting, a false emergency call meant to weaponize law. Enforcement wasn't just dangerous, it was a crime, and she had just played that card against the wrong family. The very next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the local police department, providing them with the history of her harassment and the recording I'd already shared. My wife added her own report, citing the danger of Karen's false claims not only to us, but to the responding officers who could have walked into a situation expecting violence. The officers didn't dismiss it. They listened carefully, their demeanor serious. They knew what swatting was. They knew how easily it could get someone hurt. And with Karen's reputation already making waves, they had every reason to take it seriously. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was shifting. Neighbors who once tiptoed around Karen now stopped to chat with me in the driveway. They offered support, whispered that they were tired of her reign of terror. Some even shared their own recordings, voicemails from Karen threatening fines, videos of her sneaking onto properties, emails filled with intimidation. It was like pulling a thread on a sweater. Once it started unraveling, everything came loose. By the end of the week, I had a mountain of evidence and a line of neighbors willing to back it up. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore. We were building a case to remove Karen entirely. The final straw came on a Saturday morning. Karen stormed into the community center during a scheduled HOA event, binder in hand, shouting about traitors and illegal conspiracies. She pointed directly at me, accusing me of undermining the board, of corrupting the neighborhood. But instead of rallying to her side, the neighbors stared at her like she had lost her mind. One man in the back finally stood. "Karen, enough," he said firmly. "We're done with this." "You've gone too far," others nodded. Some even clapped. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She slammed her binder shut and stormed out, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits. But the damage was done. She wasn't a leader anymore. She was a pariah. Days later, the official notice came. The HOA board, under pressure from the community and facing the pile of evidence we'd provided, voted to remove Karen as president. Not just remove, ban her from holding any HOA position ever again. She was stripped of authority, her binder worthless, her threats hollow, but it didn't end there. The county attorney filed charges for harassment, trespassing, and misuse of emergency services. The police followed up on the swatting incident, and Karen found herself facing the legal system she thought she could manipulate. The night she was taken away in handcuffs, neighbors gathered quietly on their lawns, watching as the flashing lights painted the street red and blue. There was no cheering, no shouting, just a heavy, relieved silence. The reign of terror was over. As the cruiser pulled away, my wife stood beside me, her arm brushing mine. "You handled that well," she said softly. I shook my head. We handled it well. For weeks afterward, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. People smiled more, stopped by to chat, waved as they passed. The fear Karen had woven into every corner of the community was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom. One afternoon, a neighbor brought over a plate of cookies as a thank you. "You stood up when the rest of us were too scared," she said. "We'll never forget that." But the truth was, I hadn't done it for them. I'd done it because Karen had crossed a line into my home, into my life, and I wasn't about to let her win. Still, knowing that others had been freed from her grip was its own reward. As for Karen, the last I heard, she'd moved out of the neighborhood entirely. Couldn't handle the glares, the whispers, the knowledge that she'd been dethroned. Her house sat on the market for months, the for sale sign a constant reminder of her fall. Life settled back into normal. I mowed my lawn without worrying about tape measures. I flew my flag without fear of fines. My wife came home from her shifts to a quiet street instead of drama. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, I sat on the porch with my wife, sipping iced tea. The neighborhood kids rode bikes down the street, laughter echoing. The air felt peaceful finally. Funny, I said, watching the kids race past, how one person can cause so much chaos. Funny, my wife replied with a smirk, how fast that chaos crumbles when someone stands up to it. We sat in silence then, enjoying the calm we'd fought so hard to reclaim. The HOA still existed, of course. Rules still applied, but they were reasonable again, handled by people who actually cared about the community instead of controlling it. The neighborhood became what it was meant to be, a place to live, not a battlefield. And every time I saw that flag fluttering gently in the breeze, I couldn't help but smile. Not because of what it represented to me, but because of what it symbolized now to the whole neighborhood. The moment when fear gave way to freedom, when silence turned to defiance, when one bully finally met her match. Karen thought she could send cops to my door to intimidate me. She thought she could twist the law, bend the neighbors, control the board. But in the end, all it took was the truth, persistence, and a little courage to topple her empire. And when the cops she once tried to weaponize against me came instead for her, well, that was the kind of poetic justice you couldn't script better if you tried. The story of Karen became something of a legend in the neighborhood, told in hushed tones at block parties and chuckled about at barbecues. Remember when Karen called the cops over a flag? Someone would say, and the whole group would laugh. It wasn't just a story about one woman's downfall. It was about a community learning to stand up, about fear giving way to unity. And for me, it was a reminder that sometimes the loudest voice isn't the strongest. It's just the one that needs to be challenged. That night on the porch, as the first stars flickered overhead, my wife leaned against me and whispered, "We're finally home," and she was right. Because for the first time since moving in, the house wasn't just a place we lived. It was a place we belonged.